The 7 deadly sins: lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, pride. Fall foul to any of these vices, then your soul may be destined for hell. Well, or so they say. But where do these deadly sins come from, and why are there 7 of them? All this and more as we explore the origins and history of the 7 deadly sins. A dictionary might tell us that sin is an action or type of behaviour which is believed to break the laws of God. Straightforward enough: stray away from God's law and you're a sinner. The 7 deadly sins are not strict laws like the 10 Commandments. We're not dealing with "thou shalt not lose your temper." Instead, the 7 deadly sins are a list of negative character traits to be avoided at all costs. Otherwise known as vices, they're a list of 7 unpleasant habits that can lead to further immoral behaviour. See them as a sort of gateway drug to a life of evil. Take, for example, greed. It's not to be confused with gluttony, which is about overeating. No, greed is a vice that causes the sufferer to crave material possessions like money. Greed can lead to acts of selfishness and cruelty, and of ruthlessness to get what you want, no matter what or who gets in the way. Pick one of the 7 vices, like pride, lust and sloth, and you'll spark a domino effect of misdeed. And if you're a glutton for sin, why not go for all 7? Watch the world burn. What I'm getting at is this: the 7 deadly sins are best seen as bad lifestyle habits. Habits that lead to acts of sin, but are not sins in and of themselves. Either way, they ought to be avoided for a virtuous life. And speaking of the good life, did you know that each deadly sin has a positive counterpart? Known as the cardinal virtues is a series of good qualities that are diametrically opposed to each of the deadly sins. We have chastity instead of lust, temperance for gluttony, charity for greed, diligence for sloth, patience for anger, kindness for envy, and humility for pride. Live a life according to these 7 virtues, and good deeds will surely follow. Anyway, back to the sins. Have you ever wondered why there are only 7 of them? Why not include cowardice or treachery? The number 7, especially in the Abrahamic faiths, have always had a spiritual significance. In the book of Genesis, we have the 7 days of creation. In Exodus, there are 7 days of the Feast of Passover. And in the Gospels, 7 demons were cast out of Mary Magdalene. If you're going to have a list of deadly sins, 6 and 8 won't cut it. 7 is just right. Now, although 7 is a prominent number in the Bible, you may be surprised to learn that a list of 7 deadly sins do not actually feature in either the Old or New Testaments. The biblical concept of sin is a bit varied. It really depends on whereabouts in the Bible you're reading. In the Old Testament, sin, in Hebrew chatah, is more of a legal thing. To sin is to fall short of God's law, as laid out at Mount Sinai to Moses, as part of God's wider covenant with Israel. Some of these laws are very familiar. We find them in the 10 Commandments, like "thou shalt not kill" and "thou shalt not steal." But there are plenty of more laws than just the 10 Commandments. In fact, the Old Testament contains a whopping 613 of them. For example, do not consult a psychic or spiritualist. Do not muzzle an ox whilst it's treading out grain. Do not eat pork nor shellfish. And don't eat winged creatures like bats. In the Old Testament, to transgress any one of these laws is to fall out of the covenant with God, and therefore become a sinner. Now, it's a common misconception that sin features heavily in the story of Adam and Eve. Nowhere in the story does the word sin, or chatah, ever appear. No talk of the devil either. The idea of sin entering the world through a forbidden apple is a later Christian interpretation of this much older Hebrew story. Speaking of Christianity, let's move on to the New Testament and its understanding of sin. Sin is not mentioned in terms of law, but more a state of being that all people are in, a state that humanity needs rescuing from. Whenever the word sin is mentioned, it's primarily in the context of forgiveness, typically understood as being through Jesus. There are some sins, known as eternal sins, that are simply unforgivable. The sin in question is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. According to the Gospels of Mark, Matthew and Luke, failing to show proper reverence to it will immediately put you into eternal hellfire, and no amount of prayer and penance can save you from it. But nowhere do we find talk of the 7 deadly sins. Perhaps 1 or 2 verses condemn a particular sin like pride or greed, but not a neat list of vices as we have it today. Instead, it was compiled later in Christian tradition. The 7 deadly sins are believed to have come about with a monk known as Evagrius of Pontus, who lived around about 345 to 399. He was a hermit in the Egyptian desert and lived a life of harsh asceticism and spiritual solitude. Evagrius drafted up a list not of 7 sins, but of 8 so-called evil thoughts. He believed that there were 8 vulnerabilities of the human soul, cracks in the heart that all humans are prone to by their nature. The evil thoughts are quite familiar. We have gluttony, lust, greed, anger, sloth, pride, and 2 new ones, vainglory, which is a type of boasting, and sadness. You may have noticed that envy does not feature in his list, but they're a bit more dialed down from the 7 deadly sins as we know them today. So for gluttony, instead of gorging on food and overfeeding, it was more of a deviation from fasting, and sadness, which is unique to his list, is a nostalgia for what was or what could have been, and not living in the present. Evagrius's teachings of the 8 thoughts would have been lost to history were it not passed down by his students. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 590, the list got into the hands of Pope Gregory I. He revised these 8 thoughts into 7 sins, and combined sadness with sloth and vainglory with pride, and then he added envy. This is the basis of our 7 deadly sins as we have it today. Moving onwards to the medieval era, and the 7 deadly sins became a part of a growing theology of sin in Western Christendom. But it was the poetry of Dante that really put the 7 deadly sins on the cultural map. You would have likely heard of Dante's Inferno. It's only the first of 3 parts of a much larger poem known as the Divine Comedy. Read as a whole, the Divine Comedy is a tour of the 3 heavenly realms, hell, purgatory, and heaven. Part 1, Inferno, is a detailed and grim tour of hell. It's envisioned as a great downward funnel boring deep into Earth's core, with Satan frozen in ice at the bottom. Hell is made up of 9 concentric rings, and each ring houses a different type of sinner, some of which include our 7 deadly sins. For example, Ring 2 houses the lustful, who are punished with a barrage of perpetual winds. Ring 3 holds the greedy, who must carry around great boulders all day. Whilst Inferno features some of the deadly sins, the second part, Purgatorio, is based almost entirely around them. According to Catholic belief, purgatory is the place where the souls of the Christian dead must be challenged in order to get rid of any remaining sin and pass on to heaven. In the Divine Comedy, purgatory is envisioned as a giant mountain somewhere in the southern hemisphere. The mountain has 7 terraces, each one corresponding to one of the deadly sins. Many of the challenges are quite gruesome. For example, to pass through the terrace of envy, souls must have their eyes sewn shut. For gluttony, the hungry have delicious fruit hung above them, tantalizingly out of reach. And for lust, the final terrace, it's a wall of burning flame through which everyone must walk through. Once you've passed the 7 challenges and purged of all sin, you reach the peak of the mountain, the Garden of Earthly Paradise, which happens to be the Garden of Eden. And off to heaven you go, which is told in Dante's Paradiso. Dante and beyond, the 7 deadly sins have enthralled our imagination. They've become the basis of paintings, books, movies, and even this very video on the internet. And whilst much is left to be said about them, they've certainly come a long way from the 8 thoughts of Evagrius.